I have very vivid memories of my job interview in the basement of this church. And some of you were there. Ann Crowley was there. Walter Manley was there, and a few others. It was late 2005. We had gathered around those black tables we all have dinner around down in the basement, and each committee member was assigned to ask me a question. Do you all remember that? You all had questions. I remember that I wore this very snappy blue blazer and a rather bold orange tie. Maybe not the best thing for an interview, but I wore it anyway. But what I remember most about that interview is what I said off the cuff to you all about effective ministry. I told the committee that some of the most important work I have ever done as a pastor started as an interruption. People stop by the office, the telephone rings, I'm on my way to a meeting when somebody I know sees me on the sidewalk and says, "Pastor, can I talk to you?" It may not be convenient, I told them, but it is the way God seems to work. Well, that's true. What I didn't tell the committee on that day, because I really wanted the job, is that I don't really like those interruptions very much. Just ask Marcos about that. Just come downstairs sometime and have a look at my office, and you will see that I thrive on predictability and schedules and order. But as the old saying goes, I make plans and God laughs. Have you heard that? Today's gospel lesson is a story of interruptions. It's really two stories woven into one, marvelously woven by the evangelist into one fabric. Jesus had just returned from the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the Gentile side, where he had cast a demon out of a poor man who lived in a cemetery and literally bayed at the moon. Jesus stepped off the boat, and as soon as he did, the evangelist said, a great crowd gathered around him. Now imagine it. One step behind Jesus is the water that he's just come from. One step in front of Jesus is the press of human flesh. It's almost as if he can't quite catch his breath. Suddenly, a man named Jairus, an important man, a leader of the local synagogue, walked up to Jesus and fell at his feet and asked him, Mark says, repeatedly, to come and heal my daughter. She is at death's door. Well, whatever else Jesus had to do that day was going to have to wait. Life had interrupted. An emergency interrupted. So off they went to Jairus' house. And Mark throws in this detail that as they went, a large crowd followed them. The press of flesh, no room to breathe, people demanding his attention. In the midst of that large, noisy crowd, there was this woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. In what reads like a jab at modern healthcare, Mark says that this woman had spent all the money she had on doctors, but she still wasn't better. She didn't get well, all she got was poor. Maybe she saw Jesus as her last hope. And so she gathered all the strength in her anemic body that she could muster, and she pushed her way through the crowd of people. And this is important, because when she did that, she discarded the social taboos of a woman who was unclean because of a perpetual menstrual cycle. She should not have been touching anybody. But she didn't care, because she was desperate. Because she needed what Jesus could give her. And she hoped that if she could just get close enough to him, just this close, to touch the hem of his robe, she would be made well. Well, she did. In the press of all that flesh, she reached out, she touched his robe, and Jesus felt power go out of his body. There was this exchange of energy, so to speak. And in that moment, his urgent trip to Jairus' house was interrupted again. He stopped in his tracks and he said, "Who touched me?" What a ridiculous question, right? In the press of flesh, who touched me? And the woman, knowing that she had been caught, came forward and confessed. Maybe she expected a reprimand from this dusty rabbi, but instead what she got was, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And at that moment, there was another interruption. As Jesus was talking to the woman, some folks from Jairus' house arrived and said that the little girl was dead. Jesus didn't need to come anymore. And it is here in that moment that Jesus preached his shortest sermon ever. Do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only believe. It's a sermon I need to hear again and again. And so they set off to Jairus' house, and when they arrived, the professional mourners were already there. This is what people did, people with money in that day. They hired the professional mourners who were weeping and wailing and raising a ruckus. And some preachers criticize that, but what else do you do when a child dies but raise a ruckus? Jesus said that the little girl was only sleeping. Well, this made the professional mourners who knew what death looked like, this made them laugh. So Jesus threw them out of the house. Peter, James, John, Jesus, Mom, and Dad all enter the room. The little girl is in her bed. She is pale and growing cold. It's interesting to note that in the ancient world, a lot of children died before they reached adulthood. Scholars say that 60% of live births in Jesus' day never made it to their mid-teens. 60%. And because of that, the parents did not allow themselves to get too emotionally attached to their children too early in life. But apparently these parents had gotten attached. You see, their daughter was 12. She almost made it. And Jesus took the dead girl's hand and spoke to her in his native Aramaic, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. It can also be translated as, get up, little lamb, which I love. Get up, little lamb. And wonder of wonders, she did. And Jesus, concerned for her physicality, after such an incredible miracle, what does Jesus do? He says, give that girl something to eat. Now, a lot has been made of the differences between these two women. I've heard the sermons myself. One of these women was the daughter of privilege, the other one was a poor woman and a pariah to society. One of these women was just coming into her womanhood, and the other one was cursed by her womanhood in a perpetual menstrual cycle. And a lot of sermons have been preached about the similarities of these two women. Both were female, both were second-class citizens. Both were considered unclean. One because of death, the other one because of bleeding. Both of them were in desperate situations. A lot of fine sermons have been preached about how these two women were different and how these two women were the same, but today I'm far more interested in the interruptions to Jesus' day. and what those interruptions say about God, and what those interruptions say about us as we try to live this life of faith. So first of all, what do those interruptions say about God? Well, the most obvious thing it says about God to me is that life in the Spirit of God happens in between appointments. God interrupts our lives at the most inopportune times. It is precisely when I don't think that I have an extra second that grace is most likely to break in. If you want to see God at work in the world, and I'm serious with this, if you want to see God at work in your life, then learn to pay attention to those moments when you are busiest, when you are most distracted, when you are in transit, when you're late for a train or an appointment. Learn to pay attention in those moments. It's also interesting to me that while Jesus was responding to one interruption, another one came, and he didn't get frantic. Jesus allowed himself to be diverted from the urgency of one to the urgency of the other. He just flowed with it, sort of riding on the Spirit. He flowed. Some scholars point out that when it came to the need of the moment, Jesus did not give deference to the rich. He did not give deference to the powerful man over the powerless woman. It was not first come, first served. And that action is consistent with what liberation theologians refer to as God's preferential commitment to the poor. That is, God is on the side of the poor and the dispossessed and the overlooked. So those are some things for you to think about that this passage might say about God. But what about us? What does this passage say about us? Now, lots of preachers lay it on pretty thick here and tell you that what this really means is that we all ought to be like Jesus. Jean Balderston once told me, after a sermon, that she was a little uncomfortable with the notion of the imitation of Christ because it always seems to discount our humanity. And I like that, Jean. But not this Jesus. This Jesus is fully human in these moments of interruption. When the bleeding woman touched Jesus and he felt power leave his body, the New Revised Standard Version puts it very mildly. It says, he looked all around to see who had done it. But the Greek word here for looked around, paragletheto, is really much stronger. And here's what it means. When the woman touched Jesus and power went out of his body, Jesus whirled around and glared at the crowd. And maybe that is why the woman responded the way she did. Mark writes, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Glares will do that sometimes. But then in the next moment, that glare softened, and Jesus called her daughter. The humanity of Jesus was on full display once again when he arrived at Jairus' house. He encountered the mourners doing only what they were expected to do, responding to the great tragedy of a dead girl. Jesus' ridiculous statement that she was only asleep, and so they laughed. And Jesus threw them out of the house, and I like that little detail probably for all the wrong reasons. Threw them out. Moments later, however, his mood softened. He took the little girl's hand and said, "Get up, little lamb. Get up." A glaring Jesus, an angry Jesus, an impetuous Jesus. These moments of his blessed humanity in the midst of annoying interruptions, they actually give me hope. Those of you who know me well know that they give me hope. A glare turns to healing. An angry word precedes a resurrection. And all of that seems to say to me that our initial responses to the interruptions of our lives, the way that we first respond when someone annoys us or gets in our way, is not as important as the end result. It's how we finish that matters. So soon, we're all going to go out those doors into that steamy city that never sleeps, into that crowd of flesh that always presses into that cacophony of human need. Our best laid plans for this week will be challenged by interruptions, and some of those interruptions will be sent to us by God's Spirit. Some of those interruptions we will handle well, and others might cause us to glare. And if you glare, well, that's okay. Just don't let it end that way. Don't let that be your final interaction with that person. Choose a human connection. Press the flesh. Be compassionate. Follow Jesus. Let us all follow Jesus.